Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to our journey across the United States. Today we're visiting Virginia once again and exploring some of your strangest stories. From a secret treasure map I can show you on this video that has never been decoded but supposedly hides like $60 million of treasure, to legends of tunnels running under one of your most famous universities. Your state has secrets galore. Now, quickly, if you want to support this channel, all you've got to do is like this video, subscribe, and comment. It's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright, and it helps my case for charging ahead to 1 million subs. And with that, thank you all for watching, and let's explore some of Virginia's weirdest lore. Now, I think this is a somewhat well-known story, but I think it's still worth covering, because it's one of the most unintentionally funny and oddly poetic historical quirks in all of US history. This is one of those cases where history didn't just knock on someone's door, it sorta just kicked it in, twice. This story centers on one Wilmer McLean, a Virginian and wholesale grocer who by the 1860s was living in Manassas, Virginia. McLean had previously served as an officer in the Virginia military and had retired by the time tensions between the North and South began to boil over. Thus, not necessarily being involved, in 1861 he would rent out his home to Confederate forces. Importantly, and luckily, McLean himself wasn't living there at the time, and honestly, from his perspective, this probably didn't seem like a bad deal. He made good money on the rental, and like many Americans in the early days of this conflict, he assumed the Civil War would be short and relatively bloodless. That assumption did not age well. On July 18th of 1861, just days before the First Battle of Bull Run, a Union cannonball tore through McLean's house and landed squarely in the kitchen fireplace. The home, which McLean had purchased back in 1854, had been commandeered by Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, and it was being used as a Confederate headquarters, with the barn later serving as a field hospital. General Beauregard himself was actually present when the shell came through, later recalling, I quote, "A comical effect of this artillery fight was the destruction of the dinner of myself and staff by a Federal shell that fell into the fireplace of my headquarters at the McLean house." Now, I don't know about you, but having artillery fire aimed at my cookware would probably change my outlook on the war pretty quickly, and it certainly changed McLean's. While it's easy to forget now, many people at the time really didn't expect the war to be very violent. That optimism is probably best illustrated by the fact that some Washington, D.C. socialites famously brought picnic baskets and set themselves up on a nearby hill to watch the Battle of Bull Run, like it was a weekend sporting event. It became very clear very fast, though, that this was not a bring a blanket and lemonade kind of war. Anyhow, because of this, McLean decided he was done with Northern Virginia and its tendency to attract flying cannonballs. Thus, he packed up his family and he moved them about 100 miles south to Appomattox, settling near the courthouse and the Clover Hill Tavern. There, for a few years, the McLean family lived quietly, peacefully, and blessedly free of exploding kitchens. And then history found McLean again. On April 9th of 1865, McLean's peaceful life was again shattered by the Battle of the Appomattox Courthouse, one of the final and most decisive engagements of the Civil War. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, facing inevitable defeat, sent his aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, to find a suitable place for a meeting. And Marshall, funny enough, would approach Wilmer McLean, of course, and he would ask if he knew of a good location where Lee could meet with Union General Ulysses S. Grant. To McLean's credit, he tried really hard not to make this his problem. He suggested a nearby, rather run-down house, and Marshall took one look at this and immediately rejected this position. At that point, through a mix of bad luck, some pressure, and history, I guess having a sense of humor, McLean would ultimately offer his own home, and Marshall happily accepted, of course. Thus, at around 1 p.m., Lee arrived at McLean's new house, near the Appomattox Courthouse, dressed in full uniform. Shortly thereafter, another general arrived, wearing very different colors, Ulysses S. Grant. Thus, in McLean's parlor, the two men met, they spoke, and ultimately they formalized the surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And so, in one of the most absurdly neat narrative loops in American history, Wilmer McLean, a man who just seemingly wanted a quiet life, witnessed the Civil War begin in his kitchen and end in his parlor. Now, we all know that National Treasure is the best movie ever made, and given we all know this, again, I'm glad we have this mutual understanding, it should be clear that buried treasure stories are peak lore. And in this light, in Virginia, there's an incredible story, one where supposedly we have the answer as to where this treasure is buried right in front of us, and all we need is the right cipher to decipher an over 100-year-old secret message that will tell us where it is. This story starts with a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale, a man from a wealthy Botetourt County, Virginia family, who starting in 1817 traveled to modern-day Colorado, and what was then the Spanish province of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, to hunt buffalo with a group of about 30 Virginians. That said, this buffalo thing wouldn't last long. One evening in March of 1818, it's said that while hunting buffalo, one of these men would come across a gold vein in the cleft of a rock, and this would set in motion this entire story. After this group would spend about a year and a half mining minerals, finding veins of gold and silver in the hills of Colorado. And after they had their fill, mining about $60 million of minerals in modern day, Beale himself was charged with transporting their loot back to Virginia, where he would bury it in a secret location over the course of multiple trips. In terms of records provided regarding this gold, we have the following possibly dubious information. One, in November of 1819, Beale would go near Goose Creek, about 4 miles from Budford's Tavern in Montvale, and he'd bury some gold and silver in a grave-sized plot. Then, number 2, he would go to Bedford County in December of 1821 to bury the rest of the treasure. Then, to ensure that future curious onlookers couldn't steal his treasure, he'd note its location in the form of 3 encrypted messages, one noting its location, another describing the treasure and its location, of course, and a third that names its owner and their next of kin, with the only general note regarding the treasure's location being that it was located near Montvale in Bedford County, Virginia. Then Beale would put these messages and some other documents pertinent to this treasure into an iron box, which in May of 1822 he would supposedly give to a Lynchburg innkeeper named Robert Morris, who he trusted, and he would ask this man not to read or open the box unless, within 10 years, Beale failed to retrieve these documents. Beale also promised to mail him a cipher, but lo and behold, no cipher ever came. Thus, time would pass, and in 1845, having never heard from Beale again, he would supposedly open this iron box, finding the cipher text, which he was unable to decrypt, and later leaving this box and the supposed treasure map to a friend. Now, this friend is unnamed, but he was apparently able to decipher the second one of these cipher texts. Some say that this friend is James B. Ward, but from my reading, James was not yet in possession of the cipher text, so this guy that deciphered one of them is unknown. Now, this guy deciphered this in a way that many online call simple decryption, but personally, I think it's pretty tough and pretty creative, though I suppose simple in execution. This decryption is performed using a copy of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Remember what I said about National Treasure again? Anyhow, this friend, presumably Nicolas Cage, realized that the numbers listed on this page corresponded to letters in the Declaration of Independence. Thus, the letter 120, for instance, would correspond to the 120th word in the Declaration of Independence. Then one would take the first letter of that word. For instance, if the word or words were, "I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence," the corresponding letter would be I. Hopefully this explanation remains clear through the memes. Sorry, I can't help myself. Anyhow, if you go through this effort with the Declaration, you end up with this message: I have deposited in the county of Bedford, about 4 miles from Beaufort's, in an excavation or vault 6 feet below the surface of the ground, the following articles, belonging jointly to the parties whose names are given in number 3 herewith. The first deposit consisted of 1,014 pounds of gold and 3,812 pounds of silver, deposited November 1819. The second was made December 1821 and consisted of 1,907 pounds of gold and 1,288 of silver. Also, jewels, obtained in St. Louis in exchange to save transportation and valued at $13,000. The above is securely packed in iron pots with iron covers. The vault is roughly lined with stone, and the vessels rest on solid stone and are covered with others. Paper number 1 describes the exact locality of the vault so that no difficulty will be had in finding it, which describes the treasure and a very general location. This crafty friend, sadly, was unable to decipher the last 2 letters, letters 1 and 3. Eventually, this partially deciphered treasure map would then be published in 1885 in a pamphlet by one James B. Ward, which brought these documents into the public eye, though admittedly historians have had trouble verifying who exactly this James B. Ward was in life, other than finding some records noting that a local woman named Sarah Morris died on his property, and that he was a master mason. Thus, if we are to believe these documents are real, for over 100 years there has been a trove worth tens of millions of dollars made of gold, silver, and jewels in the countryside of Virginia. And while the treasure map is literally right here on this page in front of you while you watch this video, there's nobody yet that has been able to solve it, despite the fact that many have tried and even claimed to break the cipher. That said, even though from what we can tell there's been no definite success yet, many claim this whole saga may very well be a hoax. And in this light, I may as well talk to you about findings regarding this angle. To start, if you read the Wikipedia page early on, I think you'll get a strange impression of whether these ciphertexts can actually be solved. Rightfully, it focuses on an analysis, first and foremost, which casts doubt on Thomas J. Beale being a real person, and it goes on to suggest that Beale, based on a linguistic analysis, was probably just a fictional individual made up by James B. Ward, because it compared James' pamphlet with the actual treasure hunting documents. That said, there are patterns that make me hopeful that these ciphertexts are indeed real. For example, one Carl Hammer used supercomputers back in the 1960s, so pretty much a modern-day graphing calculator, to determine that the numbers in these ciphertexts were not random. Rather, they showed patterns similar to intelligible text. In short, there is probably a message here. That said, there are strange notes. For instance, if you use the Declaration of Independence as a key for the first cipher rather than the second, it yields an alphabetical sequence: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, I, J, K, L, M, M, N, O, H, P, P, which, I think you get this, it would be nearly impossible to achieve that through randomly assigning numbers. Rather, it might tell modern readers that they're on the right track. Less hopeful, though, is that if you count these numbers in the third cipher, it indicates that it's probably too short to list 30 individuals that are the next of kin. Take that as you will, I suppose. So, I hate to be vague, but that's where this leaves us, with a mystery and 3 treasure maps, which I encourage you to try to solve on your own. And hey, who knows, maybe you're the one that'll solve this mystery all these years later. And, oh, not to ask for handouts, but if this video does lead you to earn like 60 million bucks, remember old T's story time, wouldn't ya? Near modern-day Richmond, there's a place that, depending on who you ask, is either a forgotten chunk of wartime infrastructure or something you're very much not supposed to poke around in. If you wander through the woods just a few miles east of Richmond International Airport, near what's now a very polished, very corporate technology park, you'll stumble across some deeply out-of-place leftovers of sorts. A rusted water tower, cracked paved roads slowly being swallowed by trees, old sewer lines clogged and abandoned, and perhaps most telling, posted signs making it very clear you are not allowed to be here in the first place. Further, locals will tell you that if you hang out around here long enough, you might notice unmarked vehicles, the occasional military-style patrol, and a general sense that someone or something is still keeping an eye on this stretch of forest. There are even rumors that if you get caught once, you'll be escorted to a security camera and made to stand there so they can get a good look at your face before letting you go. What happens if they catch you a second time? No one seems to report it. So what's this place anyways? Well, historically it's known as the Elko Tract, and before the 1940s, it was not much of anything. It consisted mostly of forests and fairly unproductive farmland. It did belong to farmers, but it wasn't especially fertile, and nothing about it suggested it would one day be wrapped up in rumors about secret bunkers or military activity. That changed during World War II, though. By 1943, there were growing concerns that if the war continued long enough, the U.S. mainland could face a domestic attack. Thus, in May of that year, Richmond's airport was officially brought into use as a military airfield. From a strategic perspective, that immediately made the area more interesting, but also more vulnerable. The fear was that if Axis forces ever reached the East Coast, their first goal would be to establish a beachhead, and then, next, they would do their best to eliminate any nearby airfields and fortifications within flying distance of that landing zone. Richmond, with its airport and infrastructure, would have been a tempting target because of that. Now, to counter this possibility, the federal government seized roughly 2,400 acres of the Elko Tract and forced the residents living there to vacate. The plan wasn't to fortify this land, though. It was to lie to enemy forces with it. What the Army replaced these farms with was a convincing mock-up of Richmond's airport. This fake airfield had a triangular runway, matching the real one, dummy anti-aircraft guns, and plywood airplanes that were regularly moved around so the site appeared active. Further, mock buildings were constructed to give the impression of a functional base, and there were even real barracks on site for the soldiers assigned to the project. This wasn't a half-hearted decoy. It was built by the 936th Camouflage Battalion and later occupied by the 1896th Engineer Aviation Battalion, and in a strange way, it functioned as a large-scale psychology experiment. The goal wasn't to make the place look fake, it was to make it look real and poorly hidden at the same time. The planners wanted it to appear like an operational airfield that was attempting to camouflage itself. The idea was that if German bombers were ever reported over eastern Virginia, Richmond would cut power to the city and the airport, and they'd divert it to the Elko Tract, and the decoy airfield would suddenly light up, presenting itself as the obvious target and the real Richmond Airport, while the true airport disappeared into darkness. From the air, it would look like the bombers had found exactly what they were searching for. Of course, as we know now, the Axis powers never really launched an attack on the US mainland. After the war ended, the official story is that the federal government disposed of the Elko Tract. The land entered a kind of limbo, and at one point it was almost turned into a mental health asylum for African Americans, still very much in the era of segregation, but local opposition shut that idea down hard. And then, in the 1990s, portions of the land were repurposed into what is now the White Oak Technology Park, home to data centers and facilities for companies like Facebook and Hewlett-Packard. And yet, despite that development, large portions of the Elko Tract remain unused and strictly off-limits. That's where the rumors really dig in. People speculate that wartime bunkers were built underneath this site, and some suggest they've been quietly maintained ever since then. Some believe it's an emergency shelter that could be used in the event of a nuclear strike, possibly for the president or the Virginia governor. As far-fetched as that sounds, it's not entirely without precedent either. After all, the once secret bunker beneath the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia turned out to be very real too, even though it was once just a rumor. Others take the speculation in a more extraterrestrial direction, suggesting something far stranger is hidden beneath the overgrown roads and rusted infrastructure. There's no real evidence for that, of course, but let's be honest, you can't have a restricted, half-forgotten site in the woods with military rumors swirling around it without someone eventually pointing at it and whispering aliens. That's just how these things work. If you can't tell, Virginia is no stranger to UFOs, and honestly, I think it's a compliment that I could have covered any number of famous sightings across the state, but for this video, I wanted to zero in on the Wytheville UFO saga. And yes, funny enough, part of the reason is pure bias. One time I got stuck in traffic on I-81, so I pulled off into Wytheville and ate lunch at this little place called Virginia Heights. After the biscuits and gravy I had there, I decided Wytheville was permanently the bee's knees, so here we are. Biscuits aside though, Wytheville, despite having a population of only about 8,000, has logged thousands of UFO sightings, and this whole thing really kicked off in 1987. One of the central figures in this saga is a local named Danny Gordon. Gordon was about as Wytheville as it gets. He was born there, he was raised there, he went to school there, he played football there. His passion, though, despite all of these activities, was broadcast journalism, and by 1984 he was actually the news and sports director at WYVE Radio, a country station that proudly billed itself as the voice of Wytheville. Over time, Gordon became something of a local information hub. He knew everyone, and everyone seemed to know him. And part of his daily routine was calling the sheriff's office every morning just to ask them what was going on around town. And usually this was nothing dramatic, but on October 7th of 1987, the answer he got was different. For starters, he was told that one police officer had managed to kill 5 chickens with just 2 gunshots, which is already an interesting way to start the day. But then came the real story. 5 police officers, while in Fort Chiswell, had seen what they described as a UFO, bright red and green lights moving around in the night sky. These weren't rookies or pranksters, they had military backgrounds, and Sheriff Pike didn't think they were the kind of people who would be easily fooled by seeing Venus in the night sky. Thus, after hearing this, Gordon ran a short 60-second piece on the story. At first, it was treated almost like a joke segment. You know, one of those lighthearted moments where the DJ makes a cheesy joke on the radio and moves on. But the surprise was what happened next. The phones absolutely exploded at the radio station. Hundreds of callers flooded the station, all claiming they'd also seen something strange in the sky. Gordon, who didn't consider himself someone who believed in outlandish stuff like this, figured the responsible thing to do was investigate. He said later that if he personally tried to answer every call, he would have had to live at the station basically. So in the short term, he ignored these calls, and then on October 17th, he had to set up a dedicated call-in program just to keep up. And what did all of these reports they were getting amount to? Honestly, everything, but also nothing at the same time. People described UFOs lit up like Christmas trees with red and green lights, but also giant egg-shaped objects, silent black triangles gliding overhead, even ominous cubes of sorts. Gordon's initial assumption was that people were either confused or misidentifying experimental military aircraft, possibly from the nearby Langley Air Force Base. He also thought maybe folks were seeing refueling booms or aircraft mid-refueling. To check that theory, he actually called the Pentagon, and according to Gordon, he spoke with a general who told him that mid-air refueling below 13,000 feet would have been a serious violation of protocol. In other words, if locals were seeing aircraft mid-refueling, that would mean they were below 13,000 feet, and someone would have been in very big trouble already. As word spread, national media outlets began to show up in Wytheville, hoping to catch these strange lights for themselves too. And after a few weeks of fielding reports, Gordon decided he might as well join in and try to see one of these things firsthand. Thus, on the night of October 21st, he grabbed a still camera, a video camera, and a friend, and he went looking. For hours, they saw nothing. Then, while driving home along Route 21, something bright caught their attention. They pulled over, they jumped out of the car, and they watched what Gordon described as a massive object coming across the horizon. This object had no wings, it had a dome-like shape, and it had a strobe of multicolored lights. And while they watched, a red ball of light approached from the left. Then, Gordon would describe the larger object as appearing sort of like a mothership, which promptly slipped into a thin layer of clouds, and the red ball that had just appeared followed and appeared to sort of dock with it. And yes, during this entire experience, they forgot their cameras in the car, as one does when you're observing a history-changing phenomenon. 2 nights later, on October 23rd, they went back out, and this time they saw a similar object, and did manage to take photographs. The following day, Gordon held a press conference that drew a sizable crowd, including locals and tabloids like the National Enquirer, but there was already some weirdness creeping in. See, the night before this conference, Gordon received an anonymous phone call warning him to be careful. The caller claimed that the CIA and other federal agencies were taking interest in the case, and they suggested that Gordon back off, because this was supposedly a defense matter. Shortly after this, Gordon's home was broken into. And don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly saying the Men in Black kicked in the door, but a lot of people have wondered whether someone thought he might have snapped a little too much on film. Regardless, the joke's on the intruder, because the photos Gordon had taken reportedly refused to develop anyways. Gordon kept going despite all of this, though. He continued nighttime searches, sometimes bringing along his wife and his 3-year-old daughter, and on one outing, he believed he saw 4 disc-shaped objects, and each time he snapped photos, the object seemingly changed shape. And when the film developed, the images showed something odd that confirmed this. From one photo to the next, the objects appeared to change shape. In one frame, for instance, they might look like teardrops. In the next one, they might look like a sphere. And then they'd look like classic flying saucers or something. Gordon certainly wasn't alone in this either. Over roughly 3 months since the initial sighting, there were over 1,500 sightings reported in the area. People consistently described silent craft behaving in ways that didn't match conventional aircraft. And then, one day just before Gordon was set to leave for a conference in Virginia Beach to speak about these sightings, he received another unsettling call, this time from a retired military intelligence officer. This man allegedly warned Gordon that the government was extremely unhappy, and that Gordon might be killed over this. He claimed that he'd investigated something similar in the past, and that federal agents had offed his son. It was pretty heavy stuff, but I'm pretty sure Gordon just kept on going and went to this Virginia Beach conference anyways. Around the same time too, Gordon once got a strange pair of visitors to his home. Men in black suits would show up, claiming to be newspaper reporters, and this meeting was strange. One of these individuals would wander around Gordon's house uninvited, behavior that admittedly would get me to throw people out of my house. And meanwhile, another took photos and conducted an interview with Gordon. These two identified the newspaper they supposedly worked for, but when Gordon later contacted that outlet, he was told these men were not on staff. Oh, and the wandering visitor allegedly made off with Gordon's photo negatives too, something that he would realize weeks later. All of this stressful activity just kept going, and 2 months later, Gordon would suffer a heart attack, reportedly from exhaustion. Now, Gordon would survive, but it served as a pretty stark warning that this whole situation had spiraled far beyond quirky radio stories. And, at least in the words of Gordon, while he remained curious, this was his cue to sort of leave this saga behind him. That said, he would do a little bit more. See, there was another key voice documenting all of this, a man named Paul Dellinger, another longtime Wytheville resident and reporter for the Roanoke Times. Dellinger covered the Fort Chiswell sightings and, like Gordon, was inundated with reports from locals, and even once observed this craft himself. In 1988, Gordon and Dellinger together would join forces, and they would write a book about this saga titled Don't Look Up, the real story behind the Virginia UFO sightings. Regardless, to this day, there's still no official explanation for what people saw. That said, before we move on, there's one detail that did pique my interest. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, took interest in this case, and they interviewed locals, specifically focusing on sightings that lasted longer than a few seconds, but weren't so long that they could be explained as planets or celestial bodies lingering for an hour or so. In these Goldilocks sightings, MUFON found a recurring description: a T-shaped, semi-rectangular craft, consistent across these more temporally plausible reports. This, according to MUFON, is the only time this description of craft has ever been repeatedly witnessed, which is why you're seeing my own artistic rendition of it on screen. When you think of the Cold War, or at least when I think of it, I usually think of the USA and Soviet Union as having been at odds with one another to the extent that they really didn't want to talk, sort of like two scorned lovers. But in reality, this isn't fully representative of the Cold War. I mean, yeah, the two didn't like each other at all, but they did correspond. For instance, throughout the Cold War, the Soviets and Americans had ambassadors to one another's countries, and it's one of these ambassadors that this story calls its main character in a way. A man named Anatoly Dobrinin, who was probably the most famous Soviet ambassador during the Cold War, as he was the one who served through events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And on April 23rd of 1966, the Associated Press would report that this man would identify a location for a summer camp and recreation area for the kids of those employed at the Russian embassy. This location was a mansion in northern Virginia along the Shenandoah River between Leesburg and Winchester, and my impression is this was a beautiful place, ideal for some kids to have a summer getaway. That said, what wasn't mentioned is that this, mansion owned by diplomats who called the United States' greatest adversary home, it was at the base of one Mount Weather. And why is this important? Well, see, Mount Weather was not publicly advertised as such at the time. This was all very classified, but it was what is referred to as a Cold War continuity of government site. In other words, if there was a nuclear attack, senior federal officials would be evacuated here and housed in the large underground bunker complex underneath that was built into the mountain to withstand a nuclear blast. And this location contained offices, dorms, power generation, water, communications infrastructure, and even an alternate national command and communications hub to get the military humming again. And of course, right next to this now, there would be Soviet-owned property. Getting back to Anatoly though, it's likely he himself and this retreat were simply a front for whatever was truly going on here. Anatoly, to be clear, was cautious and disciplined and a very professional diplomat. He wasn't really known to be someone who was reckless or flashy. Thus, most think that Anatoly's role was simply to purchase this land and property on behalf of the Soviets, and then other likely KGB-affiliated individuals within the Soviet agency would handle the rest of whatever intelligence operation was going on here. And my favorite part about this saga is that I think everyone involved knew what was going on. For one, locals quietly knew there was an interestingly large population of military men seen in towns nearby, and now and again, black helicopters would fly around the mountain. Locals basically fully expected this place was something hush-hush, to the extent that a local reporter actually called the summer camp being put here, I quote, "a stupid move that tempted the fate of the unknown," and implied that maybe the locals were just incorrect the whole time, thinking that this place was something important to national security. So in short, this Mount Weather site was a very important secret and simultaneously a very poorly kept secret, and thus the Russians probably very easily determined this location as valuable to national defense and built this so-called retreat here where they could easily keep an eye on the sky for helicopters and potentially watch for the arrival of a motorcade arriving with very important people to this underground bunker. And of course, the US officials were probably just as aware that the Soviets were right below them this whole time too. For some reason, this reminds me of all of those videos of undercover cops trying to buy special green flowers at smoke shops, or the Steve Buscemi meme saying, "Hello, fellow kids." Anyways, let me know if you've heard this one before. I think this whole saga is absolutely fascinating. Okay, before we go any further, I need to be very clear about something. I'm about to talk about some folklore that's rooted in something that's very real, that's extensively mapped, and is something that has photos of it, with all of this dating back to internet forums in the early 1990s. This internet folklore revolves around the steam tunnel network that runs under Virginia Tech. And while to this day you can technically access this place, I have to be very candid and tell you that you absolutely should not access this place. If you do enter these tunnels, the least of your worries are that this place is illegal to enter, to the extent that doing so will slap you with a felony that will make your future employers like you a little bit less. People on the forums I'm referencing frequently note that one of their crew they explored with here got busted, as there are motion sensors down in these tunnels, and these kids were expelled for entering. Further, these tunnels are dangerous as heck otherwise. They carry live steam, electricity, and communications infrastructure. They can be extremely hot, wet, and confined, with real risks from steam releases, electrocution, and also fun stuff like asbestos exposure. They are real-life dangers, and you'd be lucky if the only thing you ran into down here was an urban legend. Do not try to enter this place. Now, with that liability buffer out of the way, I'm going to tell you about the lore surrounding these supposed tunnels. See, dangerous or not, there are rumors that these tunnels running underneath Virginia Tech's campus don't just extend between modern buildings, they extend to relics of the campus's past. These tunnels, estimated to run for 6 or so miles in total, extend to 2 places in particular. One, they say they run into the undercarriage of what used to be Miles Stadium, Virginia Tech's old football stadium, from 1926 to 1964, and that in these leftovers you can find the remains of an old locker room, with some untouched but locked lockers still having jerseys and cleats of old athletes inside. And as for where these remains are, well, they supposedly rest under a modern-day campus landmark known as the Prairie, a sort of grassy park in the middle of campus with an outdoor fitness area and tennis court. And they say they also rest, to some extent, under the modern Hodge Hall and O'Shaughnessy Hall. Further, there's another old structure whose underground remains are left over, the old local library. The forum says that getting to this particular landmark is pretty dangerous, but that these underground remains reside near Virginia Tech's War Memorial Chapel, and they say that once inside, you can find some scarce remains of this structure. You know, bookshelves, a few books, and old tables and chairs with Virginia Tech branding on them. And as for whether these rumors are true, well, if you ask me, I'd say probably yes. There are forums that you have to find on the Wayback Machine dating back to the 80s and 90s where people that were then students are literally just discussing how to enter these tunnels and get to these old abandoned landmarks, and then discussing what they found while they were down there. I don't think that back in the 80s a fake conversation would have been posted on a Virginia Tech specific message board just for show, and thus it stands to reason these tunnels probably lead to these landmarks today. And in addition to real things dwelling under campus, there's some strangely credible folklore about these tunnels too. To start, most notoriously, there are rumors that in the 1940s, when these tunnels also existed, there were some German faculty at Virginia Tech who would have secret meetings down here discussing things that national security probably would have been less than amenable to. And I don't know how much stock I put in this one post, but this is supposedly rooted in some strange documents once found in a portion of these tunnels related to World War II era Virginia military infrastructure, and simultaneously in some offensive symbols written on the wall next to them. Some other legends are darker though. There's a story of an escaped patient from the nearby Radford State Hospital hiding in these tunnels in the 80s, and while at first I wouldn't have put too much stock in this claim, there are hints that in the late 80s someone very well may have been living down here, as forum posts indicate that people began to find plates, cutlery, and even clothing in these tunnels, and university officials noticed this too, putting up extra signage warning of the dangers of trespassing around this time. Anyhow, those are the supposed secrets hiding in the tunnels under Virginia Tech. And again, don't you dare go down there, darn it, it's really dangerous. Now, this last story isn't exactly folklore. There's no monster, there's no night of terror, no campfire punchline, but it is an extraordinary tale, and it's one that's not really easy to discuss. Because in early America, there were people who looked at their lives as slaves and decided that living in a swamp was still the better option. See, in Virginia and North Carolina, that swamp was the Great Dismal Swamp. And this story doesn't really start with the Great Dismal Swamp. It starts in 1619, when the first Africans arrived in the Virginia colony aboard a ship called the White Lion, a Dutch privateer ship. There were about 20 African individuals on board, seized from a Portuguese slave ship transporting them from Angola to the Americas, and at the time, Virginia had no formal slave code. Those wouldn't be enacted until 1661. So legally, these African people weren't slaves, but they were rather indentured servants, meaning they could earn or purchase their freedom, and also conversion to Christianity could legally bar their enslavement, since English colonists were opposed, at least on paper, to enslaving fellow Christians. That legal gray area didn't last, though. Over the following decades, slavery hardened into law, and paths to freedom narrowed, and along with this practice, some of these enslaved people decided to leave this system entirely. These people became known as Maroons. Now, I hope you enjoy my neighbor's BMW running really loudly, but this term maroon, the literal word, likely comes from the Spanish word cimarrón, meaning wild or untamed, and the term originally described escaped enslaved Americans who fled colonial control. That said, in the English colonies, it came to mean something very specific: people of African descent who had self-liberated and established independent or semi-independent communities, often in places where colonists found it nearly uninhabitable, and the Great Dismal Swamp was just about perfect for this sort of difficult escape. Now, before Europeans arrived, the indigenous people lived around these swamps, but as European settlements expanded and the natives left the region, these swamps became a sort of gray area. It was land that was really hard to live on. The Great Dismal Swamp was massive, it was wet, it was insect-choked, and it was dangerous. Further, it flooded constantly, and it hid snakes and gators and disease and heat, and thus the Europeans had no interest in taming this area. That said, this is exactly why it made such a great hiding spot for the escaped enslaved people. These escapees were settled primarily on mesic islands, slightly elevated, sort of drier patches scattered throughout the swamps. These weren't islands in the ocean sense, but they might as well have been. From these high points, the Maroons were able to build small communities using natural materials. They hunted and trapped for food, and they were able to cultivate some limited crops on this relatively infertile land. Now, some of these Maroons were permanently self-liberated fugitives, and others were people who had actually purchased or earned their freedom and didn't know where else to go. Heck, some even used the swamp as a waypoint along the Underground Railroad and were just temporarily passing through as they made their way north. And at any given time, historians estimated that around 2,000 people lived in the Great Dismal Swamp, and over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, as many as 50,000 Africans and their descendants may have passed through or lived here. Survival here required some kind of compromise, though, and even if these people were semi-free, they had to carefully tread on their relations with nearby settlements. See, nearby white communities often tolerated Maroons so long as they remained quiet and paid informal quotas, labor, timber, or goods. Local businesses frequently ignored their fugitive status in exchange for work, too. That said, this was not a peaceful coexistence. White colonists feared Maroons for admittedly practical reasons. The Great Dismal Swamp, you see, was a refuge, but it was also a base of resistance. Several 18th century slave insurrections were linked to Maroon communities, and some Maroons organized armed bands that actually launched raids against plantations and nearby towns. From the perspective of enslavers, the swamp wasn't just hiding runaway, it was incubating rebellion, and that fear therefore translated into action. In the 1820s, militias were sent into the swamp to destroy Maroon settlements, and in 1847, North Carolina passed a law explicitly aimed at capturing these Maroons living in various swamps. Now, despite everything I've told you, ironically, we know very little about the daily lives of these communities. Further, no confirmed Maroon human remains have ever been found in the Great Dismal Swamp, possibly due to the acidic waters of the swamp doing an excellent job of dissolving bones over time. Also, archaeological artifacts are rare here as well, as Maroons owned few possessions, and their homes were constructed from natural materials that basically decayed back into the swamp after their abandonment. And finally, as you probably expected, these communities did not last forever. When the Civil War began, many Maroons left the swamp to fight for the Union, and post-emancipation, many moved north or just left to reunite with their families. And over time, large portions of the swamp were drained and forests were cleared to make room for roads, railroads, and also a little bit of farmland. But for more than 2 centuries, this place was something else entirely, a place where thousands of people decided that living in these harsh conditions was still better than living in bondage. Folks, thank you so much for joining me on this slightly more historical and lore-driven trek than my usual videos. I don't know, I guess I felt interested in history this week. Hopefully you enjoyed it though. Anyhow, as always, it was my pleasure to make this video, and I hope you enjoyed it too. And if you want to see more like this, a comment, a like, and your subscription are a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's okay at least, and that'll propel me slightly closer to YouTube Valhalla, and help me on this trek towards 1 million subs. Otherwise, next week, keep an eye out for a look at some of Wisconsin's weirdest folklore. And without further ado, whether your new Russian neighbors have a strange interest in a nearby military base, or if you live near Elko Tract and you keep seeing some weird black helicopters flying by and landing in it, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.